About to leave, already packing. Come with me, I'm not really asking. We'll get away to a place where we don't know. About to see the world in action, what we can be, life with no distractions. We'll get away, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free with me. Let's be free with Not looking back, eyes on the freeway, Bonnie and Clyde, a classic cliche. We're on the run, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free.
Good evening, everybody. John here from Tutor to You, welcoming you to another study live stream session for A-level geography. Tonight we're concentrating on sustainable urban development. Wonderful topic, but I also know it's one, talking to Abdurrahman and Suzanne before we started here, I know it's one that causes lots of confusion amongst students and teachers alike. So hopefully we're going to put a bit of light onto that one. If you're joining us live, just have a look at my little clock down here. We've got quite a few of you joining us live. Welcome, welcome. We would love to see your thoughts and your responses as the session continues. Please do use the YouTube chat window to give us answers to some of the questions that we've got. If you're joining us on replay, and we know that loads and loads of you are doing just that, welcome as well. And of course you can take your time, pause the video at those times where you feel it is necessary. Now, I don't know an awful lot about sustainable urban development, if I'm honest, but I am fortunate that I am joined by two people who know loads. So we've got Abdurrahman in the middle of the screen and Suzanne on the right hand side. Good evening both, are you okay?
Hiya, how are you?
I'm good, I'm good. You okay, Suzanne?
I'm very well tonight, yes.
Lovely.
Nice and cozy.
Absolutely. Cold outside but warm inside.
Yeah.
Anybody want to give us a little breakdown of what we're covering tonight?
Yeah, sure. So today, like you said, we're looking at sustainable urban development. If you remember, last week's session was a lot about the issues to do with cities post-deindustrialization, issues like economic inequality and deprivation, social segregation. But this week we're looking at how cities are very important agents in our drive to become more sustainable as sort of mankind, and within that there are lots of practices that we can do to make cities and the people within them a lot more sustainable.
As always, I am really looking forward to this. Right, I'll hand over to you two guys and let's get started.
Thank you.
Okay, so in terms of sustainable urban development, I've broken this part of the spec, which is about 2 and a bit lines, into 7 key questions. So I'm just going to ask you, just have a read of them. If you're watching on replay, obviously feel free to pause. If you've downloaded the slide deck, you may just want to have this printed, and you'll be able to see what progress you make towards these questions. About halfway through the session, we will check back on these questions. So starting from how do urban areas, cities, basically cities and towns, have an impact on the environment, all the way through to how can we make cities and towns more sustainable. So we won't dwell too much on that. We'll move on. So what is sustainability? The famous 1987 Brundtland report stated that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I'm sure you've come across this definition of sustainability. It's quite a famous one by this point, but you may not have known it. It comes all the way from the late 1980s. Since then, though, the focus on the environmental pillar of sustainability has been broadened. And now we look at physical, social, and economic dimensions as well. And we're not just happy with something that hits the environmental pillar, but we also have to look out for the other 3 as well. So, for example, a city's focus on air pollution is as valued as its focus on reducing homelessness, which is it's sort of trying to achieve the social dimension. In line with this, Goal 11 of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, I'm sure you've looked into for earlier on in global systems and global governance, aims to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and, importantly, sustainable. And here it is. Here's just an infographic just to put that into context. So this is goal number 11. I believe within it, it's got about 4 or 5 targets within it. Some are about making cities resilient to things like earthquakes and volcanoes, but not so much our focus today. But a huge focus is on making cities sustainable in many, many ways, not just in terms of the environment. So what is wrong with cities? What are they doing wrong now? Why do we have to change them? And why do we have to change the way we live? And the answer is we do have to change. We cannot go on as we are currently living. The evidence points to that fact. Cities essentially pose a threat to both the local and the global environment. They consume 3/4 of the world's resources and generate the majority of the world's waste and pollution. Some of you may remember a news story from a couple of years back of a ship containing a lot of waste from Canada on its way to the Philippines being turned back and sent back to Canada, who then apologized to the Philippines. And obviously that waste had come not only from sort of rural areas, but also major cities within Canada as well, which goes to show that waste is not just an issue for the country itself, but is actually a global problem, because it doesn't just stick around within borders. Cities now rely on energy and resources also from all over the world, while the pollution and waste they generate is also dispersed globally. Like I said, you may have also looked into the issue of e-waste, which is the practice of dumping electronic waste in places, for example, like the Agbogbloshie e-waste dump in Ghana. Then comes the concept of an ecological footprint. So in short, an ecological footprint is a measure of the environmental impact of a community or an individual. You may have worked out your own footprint in the past using a calculator like the WWFs. It's defined as the total area of productive land and water required to produce the resources a population consumes and absorb the waste it produces, right? And it's measured in global hectares. In a second, we'll play a game based on this. But there are huge variations, as you can imagine, between countries and actually within cities as well. Cities tend to have a higher ecological footprint than rural areas, and wealthier cities, so not all cities are the same, wealthier cities within more developed nations tend to have a higher ecological footprint than those in developing countries, as you can imagine, because of practices like consuming red meat, like driving cars, etc. In fact, London's ecological footprint covers an area almost twice the size of the UK. So although London is but one city within the UK, what space it needs to actually cover its needs is not only just the size of the UK, but twice that. In the United States, the picture is very similar. It's using twice the renewable natural resources and services that can be regenerated within its borders. So the USA needs another 2 USAs on top of its current land to make up for its greed, essentially.
Right, okay, thank you. So we're going to play our first game, and this is higher or lower. So we're going to take that theme of ecological footprints and we're going to apply it to different countries. Now, remember, the bulk of these ecological footprints are probably going to come from the urban environments within here. Now, just as a clue, the wealth of the country is probably going to impact on its ecological footprint. The density of the population, very often, because actually if people are very crowded, sometimes actually transport is less of an impact, and also the quality of the infrastructure. So just bear that in mind while we play our first game. I would love for some of you to put in the YouTube chat all of your answers, whether you think it's higher or lower. So we're going to start with the UK, which is 4.2 global hectares. So the next country, if we can reveal, is the USA. So do you reckon that the USA is going to have a higher or lower ecological footprint than the United Kingdom? I think this is an easy one to start with. You got 50-50 chance of getting it right. So if you can pop into the box on the chat function, and if you're obviously playing at home, you can just jot it down on a piece of paper. Right, John, I think, shall we go with the first one then? Let's reveal. It is, in fact, higher. Not quite twice as high, but they use a lot of resources. They consume a lot, and they need an awful lot of global hectares to absorb their waste per person. So let's go on to Brazil. So here's Brazil. Do you think this is going to be higher or lower than the USA? If you can put it into chat function. Oh, well done, John. You got it right. Right. Okay. If you think you know, let's have a reveal then, John. Okay, so of course, Brazil, not as wealthy as the USA, so its consumption or its ecological footprint, which is linked to consumption of resources and the ability for it to absorb the waste it generates, is 2.8 global hectares. Right, and the next one, please. This is Russia. So this is one of the BRICS. So we've got Brazil and Russia. So relatively similar, one would think. So this one might be a bit trickier. Do you think this one is a higher, or do you think this one is lower? So pop into the chat box, or if you're at home playing on catch up, have a think. What do you reckon? Is Brazil and Russia, they're both one of the BRICS. Is Russia going to be higher or lower? Yeah, right. Let's have a reveal, please, John. It's higher. So it's got a 5.4. It's not quite double, but there. Right. Let's go to our next lot. Okay, thank you. Right, now we've got the world now. So the world's ecological footprint. So that's everybody. That's how much we consume. And let's have a reveal. So we've got 2.8 global hectares. And let's go to the first country reveal. So we've got the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Do you think that is going to be higher or lower than the world's ecological footprint? So this one might be quite easy, I reckon. Shall we have the reveal? Thank you. Just a tiny 0.8 global hectares. Okay, let's have a reveal of the next one. So now we're going to compare Spain. So I think this one's going to be easy. So obviously country within Europe and on the European Union, so potentially a more wealthy country. So do you think this is going to be higher or lower? Pop into the chat box, or if you are playing at home, write it down. Right, John, if we can have a reveal, please. It is indeed 4 global hectares, so considerably more. Right, and our final one to compare it with is Australia. This is going to be tricky. Spain and Australia, both high-income countries. So what do you think? Which one of those two do you think is going to have the higher ecological footprint? Is Australia going to be higher, or is it going to be lower? Have a think. Write down what you think the answer is. Right, let's have a reveal, please, John. It is in fact 7.1 global hectares. So we've got considerable increase there from Australians. Right, okay. I think that is moving back over to you, Abdurrahman.
Yeah, quite an interesting one that it ends there with Australia being so high. Obviously, as has been noted in the comments, Australia is still committed to using coal, trying to, I think, in some sort of way, I think political sort of spin here, trying to spin it as clean coal, if ever coal can ever be clean. But I guess each to their own. So in terms of sustainability, as I mentioned before, sustainability is not just about the economic dimension. If you think about it, I guess, like a chair or a stool, which you can see here on the right-hand side. This chair has 4 legs, and all of them are equally important. If you just think about the chair itself being sustainability, one leg is physical, the other one is natural, the other one is social, the other one is economic. And I'd like you to bear those 4 terms in mind, especially for the next activity. And the idea of this analogy is that when one leg is not present, the chair itself, which is sustainability, or our progress towards being more sustainable, because I think sustainability is more of a process than it is an actual state in time. I think even if we are able to at one point refer to ourselves as sustainable, it's never going to be fully. I think it's always a work in progress, like development sort of is. If one of those legs is removed, then it becomes unstable, or worse, it collapses, and therefore progress towards sustainability collapses. So let's have a go at a game in relation to this.
Thank you. Right, okay, so this is the connection wall, and you may well have played this before. If you haven't, we have got 16 terms here, or 16 phrases, and the idea is that we have got 4 groups of 4 phrases, and we have to work out which they are. So we're going to start off with our first connection that we've got to look for. Okay, so the first one I'm going to ask you to try to find is 4 of these phrases which are to do with one of those aspects that Abdurrahman has just mentioned, which impacts on people's quality of life, their access to services which can affect their health and well-being. So what you need to do is try to identify 4 out of those 16 phrases that you think would be most linked to impacting a dimension that impacts on people's quality of life. Okay, so have a look through and think which ones would they most impact on quality of life and access to services. Obviously, if you're paying on catch up, you can pause and give yourself a little bit longer. If you're playing at home, you're very welcome to pop in the chat box. Some you could kind of try and paraphrase some of these, because I know they're quite long to pop in there. And you could even actually just give me some coding. So imagine the ones down the side, the y-axis is A, B, C, D, and the x-axis 1, 2, 3, 4. So you could, for example, if you think it's pedestrian zones, say C1, which would be pedestrian zones. Okay, so have a think. Which ones of those do you think are aspects which impact on people's quality of life? Am I going to see if I'm going to get any answers? If you don't want to type all 4 in at one go, do one at a time. Just give me one answer. Right. Okay, John, I think we've had a little while to think about that one. If we can just have the reveal. So these are all social dimensions of sustainability. So in order for people to have a good or reasonably good quality of life, they absolutely need access to clean water and sanitation. And hopefully your contrasting urban case studies are going to have aspects of clean water and sanitation. So it's likely that if you've chosen one of your cities in a sort of developing country, that you're going to have some information and some case study knowledge around clean water and sanitation, and what efforts the authorities are doing to try to provide that. Also, you can see that availability of food supplies, absolutely vital to have a reliable food supply, good quality. And in some urban areas, actually, the sort of reliability of transport and distribution networks can actually be kind of an area of failure, and people don't always get perhaps the best, most nutritious food, which is being transported in from rural areas. You can see that adequate provision of health services, again, absolutely vital for extending life expectancy, improving outcomes for children, reducing infant mortality rates. So that is vital for people to have a reasonable quality of life. And remember that idea of the chair of sustainability. And if you don't have those, then the chair will wobble and sustainability can't be achieved. And finally, they're adequate and affordable housing. And hopefully your case studies of both your contrasting urban areas will have examples both at different levels of wealth. So it's likely that also your case study potentially in a high income country will have issues related to affordable housing. Right, okay, if we can have the next 4 links, and I'm going to tell you these are things that are improvements or to the built environment. So how well a city is able to support people living there. So things to do with enough resources, to do with maybe secure housing supplies, water and energy and things like that. So can you choose 4 from the list that you think are going to fit the next dimension? Okay, so if you're playing at home on catch up, obviously put a pause on it. But if you're playing now, see if you can just pop a few answers in the chat box. Someone be brave. Right. Okay, John. Let's have a reveal. So here we can see our physical dimensions. Okay, so there's more green space for people, and obviously improves their sort of access to leisure and recreation, and also really good for mental health. There's quite a lot of sort of surveys, and actually one really recently, I think I picked up on one last week, which suggested that access to woodlands reduced the money that the UK has to spend on sort of mental health support. So yeah, go and hug a tree, I guess. We've also got pedestrianized zones there, recreational areas, and also their cycling infrastructure. So all of those things are improving the physical dimension of the city. Right, can we have the the next one is going to be, you've got to find these, I'm not going to just give them to you. The dimension, these are 4 linked phrases which are going to help maintain the economic growth without damaging long-term sort of growth of the city, and it sort of linked to efforts to reduce inequalities within the city. So if you can find a link of 4, please. Again, maybe pause if you're playing at home. They're probably easier to see now because we've already eliminated 8 of them. So we've only got 8 left. Right, let's give it a go, John. Let's reveal. So these are our economic dimensions. So you can see they're decent employment opportunities. Obviously, we need a wide variety of jobs, hopefully quite a lot of diversity, because if there's too much specialism, actually it can leave urban areas quite vulnerable to global changes. Regeneration to encourage investment, and I'm sure you've probably looked at a variety of different case studies. I know today I was actually teaching about the London Docklands, so we were looking at the sort of regeneration plans there, but you may have some other examples from other cities. Securing decent wages in line with living costs, and this is something that really troubles many urban areas, is how do you allow people to earn a living wage? And I know there's a big push in London to try to get sort of the cost of or the wages up beyond sort of minimum wage, because minimum wage is not enough money to live in London. And finally, you can see they're upskilling citizens to ensure access to well-paid employment. So it's really important that people have the skills, the education, and the right sort of appropriate training to be able to go into these types of employment that potentially are more formal and better paid. And that leaves our very last one. So we've got natural dimensions there. So we've got their green public transport, water management, so making sure that's carefully looked after, making sure that there's no no reason why the water would get perhaps polluted. I know I've been looking at a case study in Lagos where unfortunately some of the water pipes actually have holes in them and sewage can mix in with them, so their clean water actually can become quite polluted. Investment in green technology and innovation, and obviously different cities, different urban areas are doing that to different extents. And finally, their waste and recycling management, which I'm sure you have also looked at as you've been studying your city. Right, I think that draws us to a close with the natural dimensions, so I'll pass back over to you, Abdurrahman. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Suzanne. Just wanted to pose this question to everyone, seeing as you've been engaging so well in the chat. You've looked at these 4 different dimensions, and I've covered how actually they're all important in the sort of chair or stool analogy. So this is a bit of a trick question, and there is definitely no correct answer here. Which do you think of these 4 is the most crucial? Which of these dimensions do you think, if a city could only really use one, and I know that defeats the purpose of the analogy, but if a city could only focus on one, I'm just going to give you 30-40 seconds or so to get your thoughts down in the chat. Obviously, if you're watching at home on replay, feel free to make a note of this. And why do you think that's the case? So I'll just pause here for about 30 or so seconds. Thank you to those already putting your opinions in the chat. Please do try and explain why you think, perhaps why one is more important than another, and then we might be able to talk through a few of these. Great, thank you. Keep your ideas coming. This is great. Well done. Got a bit of a range in people's opinions, which is fine. There is no correct answer here, of course. Some good reasoning sort of coming through as well. Good justification, which is obviously so important in geography. Okay, right, let's move on. So next we turn to the concept of livability. Livability may mean different things to different people. It's actually one of the concepts in geography where the definition just depends on who you ask. But in a second, I'll try and provide you with one. For some people, it's about natural amenities such as parks and green space. For other people, it's about cultural offerings. It's about career opportunities. It's about economic and political stability, or some degree of safety within which to raise a family. It really depends on who you ask, whether it's a young family or an elderly retired person or a young child. But broadly, it's about living conditions, right? How well can people live within a city, hence the word livability. The Economist Intelligence Unit actually every year releases a report where they score cities based on these 5 categories: stability, healthcare, culture and environment, education, and infrastructure. And as you can imagine, and we always try and talk about the temporal scale in geography, COVID-19's had an impact on it. It's hard to avoid. The overall global average livability score has fallen by 7 points as compared to a pre-pandemic score. So now you're going to play a bit of a game on this.
Thank you. Right, so we have got the latest data on the livability scores, and we're going to start off with Auckland in New Zealand. So, John, if you could just reveal what the score for this city was. Okay, so it's 96 points. So we've got to decide whether our next city for livability scored higher or lower than Auckland. So if we can reveal our city, Geneva in Switzerland. So this is going to be quite a tough one, I think. Certainly, I know I've been to Geneva. It's quite nice. So looked quite a nice place to live. So I was interested to see how this fared in comparison to Auckland. So if you put higher or lower into the chat box, if you're playing at home, just decide, do you think it's higher or lower? Right. Okay, John, let's have, yes, it is. I've just seen John's comment. It is a very wealthy place with lots of green spaces. So let's see how it comes out against Auckland. So can we have a reveal? It's lower. It's actually 8th place in the world on the livability. And they seem to suggest, if you actually have a look at the information about why this has come out top, they said it was because it was really successful in its approach to containing COVID-19. So that's what pushed Auckland last year up above some of the other cities. And it was particularly good for education, culture and entertainment. What I found interesting though was when I was having a little research, when you look at a quality of life score, which is slightly different to the livability score, which looked at some other data, looking at crime, its international connectivity and climate, sunshine and a few other things. Quality of architecture was quite an interesting one they include. Auckland actually falls to 8th place. So it depends what you score it on. But for livability, Auckland's the place we all need to move to. Right, if I can have the next one. So we've got to decide, is Osaka in Japan, is that going to be higher or lower than Geneva? What do you reckon? Is that going to go up or is that going to go down? You may know a little bit about Japan. You may be familiar with Osaka. You may have covered that as a case study. Higher or lower? Tricky one. Right, okay. Let's have a reveal, please, John. Wonderful. So this one goes up. It's higher. So again, having been to Geneva, I haven't been to Osaka. I thought Geneva might be a little bit higher than Osaka, but actually it has scored much higher. Right, let's go for our third place, which is Caracas in Venezuela. So do we think that this one is going to be higher or lower for livability? So is it going to be a kind of more pleasant place on all those different characteristics that it was scored on in the index? Pop high or low. And if you're playing at home, just pop it down on your piece of paper. Right, let's give it a go, John. Let's see what the answer is. It is indeed lower. A lot lower. Look, we've fallen down there to 131st position. And obviously, I think there's a lot to do with some of the kind of political and economic difficulties out there that are causing such a low score. And our final one, Damascus in Syria. So hopefully this is one you might be familiar with where Damascus is and what's going on at the moment. So higher or lower than Caracas? That was 131st. Let's have a look. It's actually through the next little bits.
Thanks, Suzanne. So what does a sustainable city look like? First of all, I already know that whether you're watching this on the phone or a screen, that the writing on here is going to be pretty small. So feel free to download these slides either now if you're watching on playback or later on. It'll be really helpful if you could perhaps print this out and maybe annotate around it with examples of this. So I'll just read a couple, but won't dwell too much. Essentially, these are features which any city could hope to take up to become more sustainable. For example, improving access to affordable housing, making sure that walking and cycling routes are safe, making sure that homes are energy efficient. All of these things are sort of easy wins, but of course there are factors, income, funding, priorities, etc., that we'll look at later and actually prove that perhaps being sustainable, whilst it's desirable, it's maybe not an easy road. Right. So what have we covered so far? So far this session, and we've done quite a lot, games and information combined. We've got up to number 5 of these questions, and in a second, we'll cover 6 and 7. So let's get on to that. So why are we so obsessed with having sustainable cities and being sustainable within cities? There is one theory, and it comes from something called the environmental Kuznets curve, which hypothesizes that the solution to pollution is economic growth. As a society reaches a turning point, which you can see in this graph here on the right-hand side, environmental degradation, which is basically damage to the environment, actually decreases. Although it is a theory, and there are a lot of criticisms of it, the idea is that once a society reaches a certain level of development, its people become a lot more concerned with the environment than with wealth creation. And that's actually also important to help us understand why perhaps some cities or perhaps some areas around the world don't seem to care, for want of a better word, about sustainability. Perhaps their hands are tied. This can be seen in cities like ours, in London, with the increased popularity or even clout of Patagonia's recycled wool products, Adidas trainers made out of recycled fishnets, Tesla's vehicles in general. The huge popularity around them, it's almost become cool and fashionable to be green. But I guess this leaves me with a question, which I don't think there is an answer to. Does that mean that those who don't have wealth can't or won't live sustainably? To what extent is that true? It's a bit of a rhetorical question, but perhaps have a think about that. There's certainly evidence for both sides that becoming increasingly wealthy has a positive impact on sustainability, and some evidence actually of the opposite effect. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So how do we go about achieving it? As cities in highly developed economies reach their desired level of economic development, when they sort of get to the top, so to speak, and the problems associated with the past are being dealt with, social segregation, economic inequality, etc., sustainability becomes the main objective. In fact, better yet, sustainability can sometimes tackle issues left behind over periods of decline, like economic inequality, cultural diversity, social segregation. Those problems, are mentioned a bit higher on the specification for this topic. And so examples can be found around the world, whether you're in Copenhagen, London, New York, or Bangalore and Curitiba. These are places that prove that becoming sustainable is not only feasible and doable, but actually desirable and has some unintended great impacts on a population. Okay, so let's have a look at our first example. The first one comes from London. London's Bedzed is a sustainable housing development in Hackbridge in London. It was built between 2000 and 2002. So actually, I've highlighted that. I've put it in bold there so that you realize how forward-thinking this venture was. I'll let you read a couple of its features there, 1 to 5. And then I'll just briefly end on a bit of, evaluation of places like Bedzed. So as you can see, solar panels being used. It's south-facing to maximize the amount of sunlight it gets. There's no need to turn on the lights for most of the day. There's electric car charging ports. And revolutionary though it was, and it certainly was at the time, and I think it still is to this day, it's only 3.5 acres of London. It's an exception rather than the rule in London. And so the pessimist side of me, thinks that unless places like this become commonplace and unless they become the rule as opposed to the exception, then we've got a long way to go. Our next example actually comes from the other side of the world, in India, in a country of obviously very different economic development. This is based in Bangalore. It's called the Samskriti Hoysala development in the Dodakanelli district of Bangalore, and it's actually quite close to an IT hub there. Some of you may have learned about how IT and telecommunication services are booming and have boomed for quite some time actually in Bangalore. And they have the same sort of structure, and it links quite nicely to what I mentioned before about this idea that as people become wealthier, their priorities in life shift. The population of Bangalore, because they work in these high-paying telecommunications and IT jobs, have become increasingly wealthy. And so their concerns over climate change have grown as a result. Sustainability basically has become more important to them. So now they're not just happy living somewhere, they want where they live to be sustainable. So they're using external walls to reduce use of energy. They are using rainwater harvesting. They have communal areas to hit the social dimension of sustainability. They're doing a lot and doing some very good work. And these are just 2 examples. There are many other places around the world. For example, in the UAE, Masdar City sticks out as a place built from scratch, which is seen by many as a model of sustainable living. But how hard is the road ahead? What challenges are in the way? We've talked about some opportunities already, but there are lots of challenges out there. I think the main obstacle for me tends to be financial, as a lot of things are within geography. City authorities sometimes may choose short-term, cheaper solutions over long-term planning. And that is in many ways actually quite understandable. Sometimes, more pressingly, there are large numbers of people who lack access to water and electricity. food, etc. Issues that a government, perhaps you, might believe are more pressing and more important. It's hard to draw a line whether we believe the future of the planet and the prospect of climate change to be more or less important than someone's access to clean water or to food. It's really an unanswerable question. And there are further challenges. Some cities have poor infrastructure to start off with, they have weak institutions, perhaps corruption, and they've got lack of enforcement and planning regulations. Clearly, the road towards sustainable cities is fraught with a lot of challenges. It won't be easy, but there are opportunities too. For example, while there are economic and social and cultural hurdles, we have, as mankind, come up with a lot of technological advances. For example, advancements in solar panels. Solar panels have gone from being quite expensive and for the wealthy few, but given advancements within China, have become increasingly competitive, if at some point it's actually quite cheap. And so this is definitely a glaring opportunity. Okay, let's have a look at this in relation to some exam questions, Suzanne.
Thank you. Okay, so we could be presented with different kind of exam questions for this section, and we're just going to have a look at 220 markers here. So the first one there you can see is, to what extent does sustainable development in urban areas present more opportunities than challenges? So as Abdurrahman has just been talking about, actually evaluating and having a think about whether there are more opportunities than there are challenges, or maybe you feel it's the other way around, that actually there are more challenges than opportunities. So you can see there it says, to what extent. Now you have to form an expressive view, and it's always best to sort of partially agree or partially disagree. Don't sit on the fence, because that makes it quite difficult for you to argue and then create a counter argument. So you're going to be examining different evidence available. Now that will probably come from your case studies, and it's really important to make sure you've got some kind of exemplification. Now, I would suggest with this kind of question that you would look at the different dimensions of sustainability. And when you're looking at your revision for sort of prepping for these types of maybe 20-mark questions, that it's important not just to focus on all of the environmental dimensions. So sustainability, remember, is about more than just the environmental. You've got the other dimensions as well, the economic, the social as well. Think of that analogy of the chair. Okay, so it could be quite important to show the examiner at a higher level that you understand that sustainable development is more than just about the environment. So you could approach this by considering a range of opportunities in the city and then exemplify them, and then the challenges in maybe achieving those in terms of sustainability. It could be, as Abdurrahman has said, to do with the amount of money that a city might have. It might be to do with other barriers, so political challenges, or even it could be physical environment that might be a challenge. Can a city actually excel in one aspect but fall down in another? So could it be really, really good on trying to deal with some of the environmental dimensions, or the sort of those aspects, but actually socially it's failing some of its residents? Also, I would suggest that you probably look at it on a different scales. So as Bedzed, the example there is actually really, really small scale. It doesn't, it nowhere near covers the whole of London. It's such a tiny proportion. So, they might be very successful at a very small scale, but potentially some of the challenges are actually rolling this out across an entire city. Can these development projects really be scaled up to that city level? And ultimately, can cities really truly overcome the challenges? And what are the challenges of the future? Climate change. How resilient are we going to be in terms of sort of sustainability towards the challenges that we might face from extreme weather, from flooding and coastal sort of sea level rises along the coast, as many urban areas are coastal located. So it could become even more challenging in the future to remain sustainable when we've got so many sort of external challenges facing us. Right, if we could have a look, I think, at the next. Oh, sorry, I've already done those, haven't I? The next one, they evaluate the relevant importance of strategies in developing more sustainable cities. So again, this is another kind of weighing up question, one of those evaluating questions. So you'll consider several options, ideas, or arguments, and then you'll need to come to a conclusion about how important they are, potentially how much successful some of those strategies have been, and how worthy, how their relative worth in comparison to the others. Right, I think, John, if you can just move on, because there's some highlights here. Brilliant. Okay, so the idea of relative importance in this question stem is really important, because you'll need to look at more than one strategy. And you definitely need to make sure there is a comparative element. So you're actually trying to say, this is significantly more important than another strategy. So you're comparing them all the time and making sure that is the real evaluative element is clear within it. Again, you can see lots of breakdown there. Strategies you could include might be something like managing air quality. It could be developing and building a green infrastructure. It could be the affordable housing. Remember how important those different dimensions are. And then you are thoroughly evaluating the relative importance in making your urban area more sustainable. I am just going to say the best answers for this will include detailed reference to a case study or different case studies. I would definitely include a variety of different strategies used in named cities to achieve sustainability. And also, as you can see there, draw from a range of those dimensions. Don't just focus on the environment. And think about, has one strategy succeeded potentially more than another? So you can see there, the example is reducing air pollution. Is that more important? So you could be doing things like comparing in London, the congestion charge, has that been more or less effective at reducing air pollution than the cycling superhighway? Which of those two has made more impact in sustainability? Or you could compare, it says the strategy focusing on social dimension, which you might think is more important than the economic dimension for that location. So thinking, are certain strategies that a city's put in place going to in sort of maybe affordable housing, is that more importance than maybe building some kind of green areas and open spaces for people living in the city? Which of those two? Is there one that kind of trumps the other one? And also sort of thinking about a conclusion there, you really need to think about which one you think has succeeded the most and is the most important. And actually, does scale matter? So some of these strategies that you might be mentioning might be on different scales, from sort of very local level to kind of, a more sort of part of the city, moving to covering the entire city. And also, does time matter? Some things that might not necessarily be immediately successful, actually in the long term will reap the rewards from sustainability in the long term, although and something else might be much more impactful in the short term, but actually once that impact's done, that's it. That's all that can be done. There is no improvement beyond that in terms of sustainability. So again, thinking about scale and thinking about time element to your conclusion. Right, I shall leave on to Abdurrahman. I think it's got some exam gold for you.
Thanks, Suzanne. So in terms of two tips from me in relation to this section and your exams in the summer, I think one thing that often gets missed out is that the specification asks you to consider the nature and impact of the physical environmental conditions. So physical geography, the actual layout of your city, or rather your two urban areas, is very important, and specifically in terms of the implications for environmental sustainability. For example, let's say that there's a very large river running through your city, and that has an impact on where the roads can be and is actually contributing to congestion. Or if you were studying Lagos in Nigeria, you know that there's a large lagoon within Lagos, and that actually has meant that they can't build in certain areas and has led to problems with housing and with roads, etc. That's the kind of level we need to go into. You really are drawing into I guess you're sort of changing places side of your brain where you're thinking, how does physical geography impact sense of place? But this time around, you're thinking, how does physical geography impact attempts to be more sustainable? Is a city actually gaining a lot from its physical geography, or is it being restricted by its physical geography in relation to this? You may actually be asked specifically about this, but if you're not asked specifically about it, I think in terms of impressing the examiner could be a real good sort of route to go down. The other thing is the fact that your case studies are contrasting. For example, if you've done London and Dubai, hugely contrasting cities, similar in some ways, yes, but more different than similar, I think. You need to exploit this. It's going to mean that one city is doing something better than the other, that one problem in one city is more significant than in the other. You need to take full advantage of their contrasting nature when making notes, and ultimately when preparing for your exam. They are different, and so you've got more sort of meat to put into a 20-mark essay. I think that brings our session to an end. So thank you all for listening. Feel free to download the slides when this is done. Obviously, if you were here live, then feel free to watch it again. Hopefully that's been useful. I think that's our final human geography session before Christmas. So thank you for joining us at all of these. Obviously, we've got the physical geography team to thank as well for what they did earlier. But ultimately, we ended with the best, I think.
I'm
I
going to
think
agree
we're
with you.
biased, aren't we?
Definitely going to agree. Although I have to say, my performance during the higher and lower games was so poor. It's a session for me to forget. Listen, I found it as always really interesting. I was particularly interested. I was the first time I'd seen that Kuznets curve, and I was comparing that to what you were both saying earlier on about the ecological footprint of developed and wealthier nations, and there seemed to be a sort of conflict between those sort of two thoughts. Am I right? Is there a sort of conflict there, or what was going on?
I think actually it's quite interesting because if you look at the rise of environmentalism and kind of if you look at the political activism, actually it rises with wealth. Right. So it's an interesting kind of relationship that it has between economic growth. It's almost when you have enough money, you can start thinking about other stuff. Yes. And worrying about things around you. Whereas when you're worrying about how you're going to feed yourself, actually, if there's a rubbish tip outside, you're more worried about where you're going to get your next meal. So, exactly. Yes. But actually, I did notice, because I've done a little bit of Christmas shopping, and the number of shops now that are selling goods from recycled plastics. So lots and lots of jumpers. I think, I'm not going to name any brands, but a large number of the clothing shops now all advertising as being from recycled products, which is far more than there's ever been in the past. It's mainstream now. It's not just those niche kind of Patagonia type outlets. It's absolutely mainstream, and it's in all the high street chain shops.
Yeah, it's a real sort of consumer driven thing as well. Obviously, so nice things, I guess, economics. Yeah. It's only become popular and cool because consumers demand it. I mean, think about the overnight change from plastic straws to the sort of paper cardboard ones. That almost happened overnight, and that was because people had enough.
I do think we still need to question the kind of the supply chain and actually how environmentally friendly some of those are, because I think some of the kind of the advertising, when you see recycled, you just think, oh, it must be great, but actually we don't know some of the kind of the processes that may have been used to recycle those, and I think that as geographers, that's something we need to critique and perhaps consider about the supply chains, and whether they're actually as ethical as we assume they are, with the term recycled being kind of marketed with them.
I said it was interesting, didn't I? We could keep going all evening, couldn't we? Listen, thanks particularly to anybody who's been watching live and participating in the chat window. Some great answers as always. Thanks to anybody who's been watching over this entire term as well, throughout all of these A-level geography sessions. They're always welcome and fantastic answers. Big thank you to Abdurrahman and Suzanne for preparing and presenting tonight. It's been absolutely wonderful, as always. Abdurrahman said it well. The PowerPoint slides are available for you to download, so please feel free to do that and to watch the video again if you want to check up on the same thing twice. Wonderful. Well, I hope everybody has a good break and a good Christmas, and we'll see everybody back in the new year. Goodbye to everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.